when you're talking in Joshua, okay? Well, first of all, the question I want to ask is, if there is no God, why is any Old Testament atrocity wrong? Because atheists typically answer this question. I understand you're not an atheist, but when they say, well, the God of the Bible is immoral, I go, time out, what's your moral standard? If you're an atheist, there is no moral standard. It's just your opinion, okay? But a fair question for an atheist would be to say, yeah, but you're saying your God's loving, so it's a problem for your worldview. Okay, fair enough. So the next question I want to ask is this. Is God arbitrary, or does he give reasons for judging people in the Old Testament?
Solid question.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, Canaanites, I want them dead, right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol. They would heat this thing up. It was metal, and then they put their babies on the arms of this being, this idol, and watch their babies sizzle to death. In fact, Plutarch, who was a Greek writer, it's not in the Bible, he says that the villagers would beat their drums louder when this was going on, so the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children being sacrificed. Now, on every college campus I go to, typically an atheist will stand up, well, if there's a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world? Well, here's a situation where God saw evil and said, that's it, we got to stop it. Israelites, go stop it. And now they're complaining, right? So, why complain that God doesn't stop evil, but then complain when he does? Now, what they will say is, yeah, but God went too far. He said, wipe out everybody, including the children. God's stopping the Canaanites for killing children, but then God says go in and kill them anyway. How does that make any sense? Well, there's two ways of looking at this. One way is a book written by Paul Copan. I don't know if you've ever heard this book. It's called Is God a Moral Monster? And Copan's an expert in the Old Testament. And he says, when you read something like in, say, Deuteronomy 7, where it says, go wipe everybody out, man, women, child, all that, you've got to realize this is known as hyperbolic language. Because if you read the next verse, it says, and then don't intermarry with them. You go, wait a minute. If you just wiped everybody out, how could you intermarry with them? They're dead. The point is that in the ancient Near East culture, they used language like this to demonstrate that this had to be a victory, a decisive victory. It didn't mean, it would be like us saying, well, you know, the Chiefs annihilated the Rams. We wouldn't mean that the Rams no longer exist, right? It's just a strong way of saying they beat them badly. That's one view. The other view is the traditional view that, no, he literally meant to take their lives. Well, what do we say to that? Let's take the harder view, that God said everybody should die. Can God do that? Here's my question. Is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? When somebody dies, does God murder them? No, God can't murder anyone because he's the creator of life. So when he takes life, that's up to him. He can resurrect life. We can't do that, so we don't have the authority to take innocent human beings' lives, but God does. So if God wants to take somebody's life, he can, if he has a reason for it. He might explain the reason, he might not, but he has the authority to do that. In fact, if Christianity is true, people don't really die, they just change location, right? They move from one life to the next life. So God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. God can do that, we can't. Now, one more thing on this, and Copan goes into a lot more detail than I'm doing here, but one more detail on this I think we need to recognize. The Old Testament theocracy was unique and temporary. It was not the ideal for all time, but the means to a promised new covenant. God wanted to get the promised people in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah to be a blessing to the whole world. And if he gave 400 years of warnings to the Canaanites who were doing these detestable practices and they wouldn't stop, his only choice at that point, with free creatures, was to use force to push them out or to drive them out. And that's apparently what he did. Now, God can do that. We can't, but God can. So, the Old Testament is, as I say here, temporary, and it was never meant to be the ideal law for all time. In fact, everything from Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, all the way through Deuteronomy does not apply to Christians. You know the 10 Commandments don't apply to Christians? Did you know that? Only if they're repeated in the New Testament, and 9 out of the 10 are. The only one that's not repeated is keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Because who's the Sabbath? Jesus. He's already arrived. The Sabbath is our rest. But unless something's repeated and renewed in the New Testament, it's not applicable to Christians today. And this isn't taught very often in church either. Oftentimes we just go to the Bible like it's some kind of fortune book and just stick our finger in there and start reading. It's not the way the Bible is supposed to be read. In fact, this is going to sound shocking, but there are no verses in the Bible. Did you know that? There are no verses in the Bible. The verses were added about 500 years ago to allow us to navigate the text, but there are no verses in the Bible. The advantage of verses in the Bible is it helps us navigate the text. The disadvantage is we tend to think that these verses are individual nuggets of truth that we can apply any way we want. That's not the way the Bible's intended to be read. About the only place you can do that is Proverbs in most cases. Everywhere else, you've got to figure out the context and what's going on. Does this make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. There's a lot more in the book, though. Please get the book, not my book. I'm talking about